So, as we all know, we know that there's two famous types of assessments: formative assessment and summative assessment. These are the most infamous types of assessment. Formative, from the word formative, I chose to give you like a keyword or something that will click with you to remind you with the meaning of formative assessment, which is to inform for instruction. But summative, it's to summarize a final score or a final grade. The formative assessment is ongoing. You do it all the time in your classroom, either every day, every week. You have after every unit, or along the way. It's something that always informs you for learning. It informs you about your students, how they're developing, if they're getting it, and about your instruction. How are you doing with your instruction? And how students are perceiving it, and whether you need to do any remodification for the assessment or not. But for the summative, you're really looking for the final score, the level of mastery of your students, and that's only achieved by this less frequent style of assessment. Usually it's after every unit, or monthly, or even by semester, or in the final, like the standardized assessment. That's a summative. In Under the formative assessment, because of the nature of it, because you want to always assess what's happening in the learning process and the teaching process, you will have to give feedback all the time for your students, and even for yourself. You need to give yourself some time to do a reflective practice, what we call reflective practice, which you give a feedback for yourself, reevaluate and rethink of things. And feedback for your students, because your students need to always know where they're at, and whether they need to work harder in something, and whether they're getting this piece or they need to work in this. And maybe you sit with them and work with them individually or in groups based on your realization of an area for need, or an extra remediation for something. But in the summative, the only feedback the students get is basically the score or the grade. Maybe a comment here or there, but it's not a constructive feedback where you're taking an action plan to work on something. Some examples of formative is observations and keeping a checklist for students' work, self-evaluations, conferences, and discussions with your students. As for summative, it's that well-known way of doing true or false, matching, fill in the blank, all of these regular ways of assessing and testing. And I really come here to highlight the difference between the word assessment and the word test. The word assessment is to assess the process of learning. You're assessing the process of how things are happening or going, and whether it's productive or not. But here you're actually testing to find a result, an end of a goal, but not the process to get to the goal. Here you're in the process, so you want to assess the process until you get to this final goal. Your goal is in the means, not at the end. Okay, so testing is connected heavily to summative assessment, and assessment is connected heavily under assessing for a process, formative assessment. Then if you look up here, you'll find the rest of the spectrum of where things lie, and it's done the drawing here, I did it in purpose just to symbolically show that each one, where is it placed based on these two important types of assessments. Not in any chronological or importance kind of order. So the third type of assessment is called performance-based assessment. And the reason why I put it here with the arrow stemming from formative is because performance assessment is really part of the formative assessment, something that you use to assess students' knowledge and process of knowledge, but in a interactive way. And not only that it's in an interactive way like the formative is, but also the end of this assessment has to be a product. So students are performing a specific formative way of assessment, yet they're producing something at the end. So a research, a presentation, a project, an exhibition is something that relates heavily to formative performance-based assessment. Okay, so performance-based stems from formative, and it's different from formative is that the end result has to be a product at the end to show students learning. In here at the very end, I have alternative assessment, and the reason why I put it here is because it stems directly from summative assessment. And from the word alternative, it's an alternative way, it's a different way of assessing. It's not a summative anymore, it's a little bit different from summative. I want a score and I want an end result as an end goal. However, I don't want it to be in that typical format of a test. I want it to be more interactive. So I use the word hybrid to show how this alternative assessment combines two features from these two assessments. Formative because it's more interactive and communicative, and summative because it is with an end result of a score at the end. This is something like portfolios, mock exams where you can, or mock quizzes where you're actually having a score, but at the end you're still trying to learn about their learning process more than you worry about the score. Diagnostic assessment is something that heavily relies on communicative ways of discussing with the student specific elements, questions, reading with them. This communication builds a more reliable result than a typical test, and that's considered an alternative assessment because you get to have a score at the end, yet you're communicating with your student to get the best out of them, to get the real proficiency level, if we may say. So that's alternative assessment. And then authentic assessment comes in the middle, and this is not a type of assessment, but rather a kind of an adjective to describe any of these kinds of assessment. Could be an authentic formative assessment, could be an authentic performance-based assessment, authentic alternative assessment, and authentic summative assessment. What makes an assessment authentic is the right question that we need to ask ourselves. What is it? How can I make an assessment authentic? Three things that would make an authentic assessment an authentic one. First, it has to be related to real life situation, contextualized. If your assessment is contextualized based on comprehensible input like crash and called, then your assessment is valid because you're eliminating any ambiguity from the student side, and when you put it in context, students are able to infer and understand before answering the question, which might be too abstract. So real life, contextualized, comprehensible makes that valid assessment, hence it's authentic. Okay, so that's the first condition of making any assessment authentic. It's when it's real life, contextualized assessment. The second condition is if it's differentiated. And by differentiated, I mean it's appropriate for students' level of proficiency. It's based on specific objectives, and these objectives dictates your strategies and methods that are varied in its level of thinking and in its multiple intelligences usage. So it's basically appropriate for students' needs, either a proficiency level needs or an ability or learning preference need. Another part under differentiation is also it's accommodated. It's scaffolded enough for the students and where students are supported to get to the right answer. You went through a specific process with the students, with accommodation, with scaffolding, to just make sure that the obstacle in that score or grade at the end, the obstacle is not students' understanding, but it's in the content itself. If you provide the accommodation, that will assure you this. But if you do not provide accommodation and you do not scaffold, then your score ending result might be a reason or a consequence of an obstacle in actually understanding or not being able to read the question itself. Not about the content, it's about the process. There is a problem in the process. So you want, again, you want a valid and reliable score, and in order to do that, in order to make your assessment authentic, is by differentiating and scaffolding for your students. So differentiating carries two things: appropriateness in the choices of levels of proficiency and choices of strategies, and accommodation in scaffolding and providing support. So real life, differentiated, and the third condition is measurable. If your assessment is measurable with objectives-based rubrics or objectives-based sample answers, or you have a checklist, if you have all of the things that make an assessment measurable, appropriately measured, then your assessment is authentic. So these are the three conditions that would make an assessment authentic. So your performance-based assessment, if you say, I'm going to do a research, it's still fine. The more you go into describing what kind of research, the more I can give a decision on whether your research is project or assessment for your students is authentic or not. Okay, so I hope it's clear, just this very important map of the different types of assessment. And then we'll go on throughout the week on understanding more of the summative assessment. What are the different kinds of summative assessments, and what are the different accommodations that are provided in schools now, and how can you help your students to better succeed, whether this summative assessment, consider it a reliable or valid or not, but you're trying to give your best for your students. So what are the kinds and all of that? We're going to discuss this, and then we'll move into discussing formative and performance assessment, the different types and strategies of creating formative assessments. Under alternative assessment, we're going to learn about the different ways, how can you design, and that's something that I needed to emphasize as well under alternative assessment. I forgot to say that alternative assessment, what makes it different than summative as well, is something about the design. In summative assessment, usually the design of the test is given to you. The test is given to you by county or by state or by your school or whatever, but in an alternative assessment, it's usually a teacher-made assessment where you're actually making your choices what you want to test your students here and what you want to test your student there, and this is something we covered, this is something we didn't cover, this is something they can understand and it's still in their ZPD, but this is something I'm going to omit because it's not in their ZPD. So it's alternative assessment is kind of a test, but under a teacher's design format. So when we're going to do the